All right, so now everybody, we are recording our session. And let me just mention that when we come to the end of the session, as we did last time before the Q&A, we will turn off the recording so that people who have any questions, please feel free to ask your questions. You will not be recorded. At the time we finish the formal part of the lecture or the discussion, we will turn off the recording devices and you can feel free to ask any of your questions. All right, I think I am going to wait just one more minute. So we are officially at 7. And I'm going to do a brief introduction. And then I'm going to introduce you to our special speaker tonight. Some of you have already met her. I'll explain that in a little bit. I see my sons, Sam and Jackie, my daughter-in-law are on. So I see their icon. I see their icon there. They're with us. All right. Go. All right, so I'm now going to begin. First of all, welcome to all of you. Welcome to the second special presentation / discussion of fall 2022 of the Adult Center for Jewish Learning. We are presenting a series of lectures last month in October, this month in November, next month in December. Incidentally, they all have to do with issues of importance. What we talked about last month in November was the elections of November. And we had Hal Dash and we had Daniel Schnur, our special lecturers and questionnaire, who were here to discuss the elections that took place in Israel on November 1st and in the United States on November. And we had a wonderful, wonderful session. Okay. We had a wonderful, there we go. We had a wonderful session discussing the issues and the candidates in those two elections. And hopefully now we can begin to see what is going to happen. Still not completely resolved yet in Israel or in the United States, but at least we have a general picture. This evening, tonight, we are talking about a special subject, and we are privileged to have with us again our presenter, our lecturer from July 7th, 2022, Dr. Yolit Lipinski. Let me mention that when I first talked to Yolit, it was in the aftermath of the Dobbs versus Jackson Supreme Court decision. You'll remember on June 24th, the Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade decision of nearly 50 years before. And I was intrigued by all of the issues that suddenly arose. And I turned to Yolit for the purpose of talking about the issue of abortion and early life issues, especially with a view to Jewish ethics, the way Judaism views it and how that view is comparable to or different from other kinds of ethical moral positions. But tonight's lecture, it occurs to me, discussion is really more apt because, to be quite honest, and I say this in front of Yolit and all of you, I am in a congregation now. My congregation is slightly older, and we didn't have a lot of questions even before the July presentation on the issues of abortion and Jewish law, Jewish ethics. It was a subject that really didn't come up too much because my congregants and most of their old children with children, it was not an issue that was particularly relevant, but I thought it was important for us to discuss that in light of the Supreme Court's recent decision. But in my experience as a rabbi, in my work with all of my recent congregations, the one issue that constantly comes up, that constantly confronts me with the biggest issues, that's constantly the most difficult issue emotionally for me to cope with, is the question of Jewish law and dealing with the dying patient, dealing with issues of end of life. I cannot tell you how many times I have been called upon as a rabbi to help people make very difficult decisions about people that they love, people that have been an important part of their life. And now as they come to the end of life, they have very difficult questions to ask because they want to be kind to their loved ones. They want to treat them with honor. They want to comfort them. But at the same time, they know that Judaism has a certain view toward the issue of death, dying, euthanasia, and other kinds of issues concerning hospice and whatnot that come when your relatives become older. I can speak of this personally because my father just recently last month, or actually a month before, turned 99. So he is having he continues to be with us. He has wonderful moments, but we too have faced some of the difficult questions that arise at this time of life. So I have asked to rejoin us for our discussion Dr. Yolit Lipinski, who is a medical ethicist who lives and works up in Vancouver, British Columbia. I had a chance to meet Yolit and to talk with her over our recent trip to Vancouver. Together, she and her husband, Ariel, live in a beautiful, beautiful Jewish neighborhood. It's a wonderful community. Recently, my son, Sam, Shmuel, and my daughter-in-law, Jackie, have left that community, although they were going to be on to join us this evening. And I wanted to ask Yoel to talk about, Yolit, to talk about some of the modern medical discoveries, interventions that have come about over the course of the last 5 to 10 to 15, even 20 years ago, and how they interplay with Jewish ideas surrounding death and dying. We will discuss tonight, hopefully, frameworks for managing a dying patient and whether there is always an obligation for us to seek life as we address requests from family and from the dying patient themselves, as we address requests for assistance in dying. Allow me to point out that in the introduction, in the material that was sent for today, there are two concepts that I want to stress. Yolit perhaps will stress them again in her presentation. The words we used were kavod and nichum. Kavod means honor. We believe that a person is of inestimable value, that they are inestimably precious and unique, and therefore from the time they take their first breath in this world to the time they leave this world, they are entitled to honor, respect, and dignity. The other Hebrew term we used was nichum, which means comfort. I think for all of us, when we deal with people who are facing challenges in the latter part of their life, we want to treat them with honor, but we also want to extend to them every means of comfort that we can. We want to make their life as comfortable and as easy as possible. And therefore, we want to discuss this evening, given that context, what is permissible within the bounds of halacha, Jewish law. So without going on any further, I am going to reintroduce you all to Dr. Lipinski. She is eminently qualified to discuss our topic this evening. Besides her background in as a medical ethicist, she has worked in various settings, both Jewish and non-Jewish. She is knowledgeable about the areas of Jewish law we will discuss tonight. And please, if there are any questions that you have for Yolit at the end of our presentation tonight, we will open discussion, Q&A to all of you. With that, Yolit, I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself, and I turn the floor over to you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi House. It's a pleasure to join all of you once again. And I will be making the exact same caveat that I made in July. I am not the Lorax. I do not speak for all of the Jews. There are a multitude of Jewish opinions stemming from the very, very strict to the less strict. And what I will try to do tonight is provide you an overview of the most strict, just so that you're able to see how the least strict can fit in as well. I also have some brand new, hot off the press stuff to share with you at the end. So there's a lot to cover, and I hope that you remain with me for the entirety of the lecture. So when Rabbi House said, I want you to talk about dying, I must admit I was a little bit worried, because death and dying, not only in Judaism, but in secular ethics, is such a large topic. So what I strived to do, is I tried to put myself into the mind of all of you. And what might all of you think is either interesting or pertinent to you? Or where might you have some mistruths about? Or what have you always thought was true, but it may be that today I might be changing your opinion. So a very brief agenda. We'll go over what death is in the Talmud. We'll talk about the status of dying because we're Jewish. Everything has a status, and dying is its very own status. Then I'll walk you through some modern interpretations. And these are questions that I receive as a Jewish ethicist and that I receive as a secular ethicist. So what is the difference between withholding and withdrawing treatment? What about this thing that we call brain death? Coming out of Israel, we have a very interesting report. And then finally, the hot off the press thing, euthanasia and Judaism. If you see something is missing, or as I talk tonight, you say, wait a minute, what about this? What about that? Please, 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 please let me know in the discussion and the question and answer, and I will be more than happy to help you out. So why in the Talmud? For those of you with whom I did not have the pleasure of speaking in July, Judaism bases itself on source texts. And those source texts are the Torah, the Talmud, the Shulchan Aruch, the Mishnah Torah, and a few others that sort of stem off from there. So I can't just make things up as much as I would like to. In order to come up with a Jewish opinion, I need to cite a Jewish opinion. So this is a story about Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. And this is an extremely famous story because it is, in my opinion, the opposite of what you would think would happen. So Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi was actually the rabbi who put together the Babylonian Talmud. He's very famous, and his maid or his housekeeper, depending on the interpretation, is also very famous. She pops up a lot in the Talmud. She's a very wonderful woman, as you will see. Rabbi Yehuda is dying. The other rabbis declared a fast and offered prayers that he should be spared. His maid went up to the roof and started her own prayer. She said the angels want the rabbi to join him, but the people want him to remain with them. Please let the people overpower the angels. However, when she saw how often he had to use the bathroom and how painful it was for him to take his tefillin off and put them away, she changed her prayer. She said, may it be the will of God that angels overpower the people. And this is perhaps the more famous part of the story. As the rabbis continued to pray, she took a jar and threw it off the roof. They stopped praying since it was quite startling, and then the neshama, or the soul of the rabbi, went up to heaven. So I brought this down because what this story does is it sets us up for the idea of the paradox that exists within Judaism. Life is sacred, absolutely. Pikuach nefesh, absolutely. But the question I want for all of you to sort of keep in your mind is, up until what point do we have to pikuach nefesh? Is there a line? I would argue that according to Rabbi Judah's maid, there is a line, and that line may be suffering. So if we jump deeper into the Talmud, we are a very organized religion. As oxymoronic as that sounds, we once were a very organized people. And Judaism is a very status-based religion. You are male or you are female. You are married or you are single. I'm very happy to be married, in case you were wondering. And in Judaism, you are not only dead or alive, there is an in-between. And this in-between is known as the term posses. Posses is more often than not interpreted to be somebody who is actively dying. And actively dying is extremely hard to define in a modern context. I have spoken to doctors who say, oh, this patient will die in a week, and she does. And I've met with other doctors who say, I think she'll die in 3 months, and she still has not. Because dying and what dying constitutes is a process, and it is formalized in the Talmud. But in the Talmud, unlike in modernity, there's a little bit of a difference. We don't have all the technological interventions that we do now. So when somebody was either dead or they were alive, that was very, very obvious. When somebody was actively dying, there were a bunch of prohibitions that fell into place. And most of them I lovingly copied out for you here. So you may not cause a person to die rapidly. For example, if someone was close to the house and chopping wood, and then the shama, or the soul, is unable to leave the body, you must remove the wood chopper. This is really, really famous, so keep this in the back of your head. As well, you may not put salt on a dying person's tongue because he will not die. But if he is possessed, if he is actively dying and says he is unable to die until they move him somewhere else, you may not move him. You may not leave the house. You may not move him. So, would help if I knew how to use my computer. A few more laws about possess. One who is actively dying is regarded as a living person. You may not bind his jaw, nor stop up his opening. So that means stop him from urinating or defecating, nor place a metallic vessel or any cooling object on his navel. So let's say he's hot or he has a fever. We can't really bring that fever down. One may not move him, nor place him on salt or sand until he dies. I don't know what that's referring to, and I don't think I want to. One may not close the eyes of a dying person. He who touches him or moves him is shedding blood. Because as Rabbi Meir used to say, this can be compared to a flickering flame. As soon as a person touches it, they are extinguished. So too, whoever closes the eyes of the dying is considered to have taken his soul. Those two last lines are a beautiful piece of poetry. First of all, comparing the soul to a flickering flame. And we in Judaism commemorate souls with your site handle. So how apt is that description? But it appears that we seem to have two different descriptions here. A lot of importance, a lot of respect, a lot of kavod, as the rabbi mentioned earlier, is due to somebody who is actively dying. And we must not do anything at all that would hasten his death. But if you look at the slide I showed you earlier, it says here, but wait, if they're not able to die, if the wood chopper is bothering him, you have to tell the wood chopper to stop what he's doing. So we can't disturb the dying, but we can't speed it up either. So are we getting a sense of this paradox that exists here? This sort of, don't do this, but also don't do that. Just let the person actively die. Let the dying process take its course. Even more on the process, you know that something is important in Judaism because of how many times it's been discussed and how many times the ancient text has been applied to modern situations. So what I have done for you here is I brought you a source from Tractate Shabbat, and I have brought it in comparison to this more modern text. Mishma Abraham by Dr. Abraham, a very well-named gentleman. Rabbi Abraham is a very, very prolific medical ethicist, rabbi, and doctor. So in Shabbat, he who closes the eyes of a dying person is like murder. We've read this. They may be compared to a lamp that is going out. In the modern world, how is this applied? One may not administer routine hospital procedures to an OSS, such as taking blood pressure and temperature, if these procedures do not help him survive. If you have been to a hospital at any point, it is not the best place to heal. They do wonderful things, they do miracles, but it is not the best place to heal. They wake you up, they poke you, they prod you, they close the lights. This is what he is referring to. Even standard procedures like taking your blood pressure, taking your temperature, may precipitate death, and hence cannot be justified halachically if they do not directly benefit the patient. So here, Dr. Abraham S. Abraham is saying, we cannot do anything that prolongs, or dare I say, does not derive this person benefit if we're just doing it because it is routine. The reason why I brought up and spend so much time on the OSS is because this is the foundational text and the foundational concepts, rather, from which all the arguments happen and everything that you have heard comes from. So I want us to have a really, really good understanding of what OSS is. It is somebody who is actively dying. In the time of the Talmud, I would assume that that's a relatively short window. And it is somebody who must be treated with the utmost respect. Everything that may prevent this person from dying must be removed. But we also have to be very, very careful with what we do as the carers of this person to make sure that nothing that we do hastens the death. So nothing can stand in the way of the death, and nothing can help the death to come more quickly. Two very important concepts. Oops. There we go. So now that we have a master's thesis in OSS, we can now shift our understanding a little bit into modernity. So the first thing I want to say to you is context matters. And this is true whether I'm doing a Jewish interpretation or whether I'm doing a secular ethics consult. Context matters. And Jewish halacha, or the law, changes depending on the context. There's various interpretations. We are Jewish. You know the old joke, 2 rabbis, 3 opinions. The same thing applies when it comes to death and dying. We have some rabbis who are more lenient, and we have some who are more restrictive, but they all base their interpretations on the same text that I just showed you earlier. And finally, I'll talk to you a little bit about America versus Israel. And I wonder how many of you may be shocked when we get there. So stay tuned. It's like a cliffhanger. So withholding versus withdrawing. If I can just get a show of hands here, how many of you think that withholding treatment and withdrawing treatment, how many of you think that that's the same thing, just with different words? Withholding and withdrawing, the same thing? Raise your hand if you think so. Oh, okay, amazing, perfect. Withholding versus withdrawing, completely different things, and I'm so happy that you all know that. There is a secular ethics difference between them, and there's a Jewish ethics difference between them. Let's start with the easy. Let's start with the secular. When I withhold a treatment, I don't even offer it to you because it's not clinically indicated. I wouldn't, for example, say to somebody who is dying actively, oh, you're having some trouble breathing, why don't we get you a lung transplant? That's a very extreme example, but that I think is a really easy analogy. Withdrawing treatment is just that. Somebody is actively receiving the treatment, and for whatever reason, it is withdrawn. Normally, in a secular ethics discourse, it is withdrawn because it is no longer medically necessary. We withdraw, famously, we withdraw life support. One thing I would like to get out there, and this is probably controversial, in my opinion, life support is a misnomer. It is mechanical ventilation, it is ECMO, it is a whole bunch of things. But when I hear the word life support, I get a little bit worried. We'll talk about that much later. The Rama is a famous rabbi who pops up a lot in the Talmud. He talks a lot about things that have become law, that have become halacha. So he says, one may, for example, ask someone to stop chopping wood. I have wondered how many people have chopped wood near dying people for this to pop up so much in the Talmud. If the noise is keeping a deathly ill individual from dying, this is not an action, says the Rama, but the removal of an impediment to death. Let me rephrase that. Asking somebody who is making noise or disturbing a dying person is not an action that causes them to die. Rather, you are removing the opposition that is preventing them from dying. Let's take this into a more modern context. What could be an impediment to death if we are talking about modern medicine and modern interventions? Things like basic medical procedures like drawing blood or taking blood pressure, administering treatments. For example, some may choose to stop taking their chemotherapy, or even in some cases with some rabbis, life support or ventilation, mechanical ventilation, where the heart is being pushed by a machine, may be seen as an impediment to death. Now, before Rabbi House cancels this whole Zoom and throws me off the internet, let me plead my case for you. Rabbi Abraham S. Abraham, who is quoting Rabbi Zalman Auerbach, all these rabbis with these are all Orthodox rabbis. The reason why I'm bringing them down is because you would think that the Orthodox rabbis would say, no, pikuach nefesh, putting all the machines, putting all the needles, putting everything. But I want to show you no. And it's not necessarily black and white in Judaism. There are shades of gray, and here they are. So Rabbi Dr. Abraham says we need to distinguish. We need to distinguish between treatments that fulfill a person's basic need and treatments that are not considered routine. All right, so what are those? We are not obligated to administer non-routine and painful treatments which serve to lengthen life but do not cure the fundamental problem. So this is, for example, if somebody who has pancreatic cancer, very fatal cancer, and they decide to stop taking their chemotherapy, according to Rabbi Abraham, this would be permitted because unfortunately there is no cure for pancreatic cancer. It is just lengthening your life. This also applies especially if patients object to treatment because suffering is a thing in Judaism. And the notion that a patient may object to medical treatments that he or she do not want goes way, way back as far as Maimonides or Rambam has said that. So just like Jews are supposed to chase after life, there's a point, there's a border, there's a boundary. Let us continue. So Rabbi Shlomo Zalman, in his book, where he has all of his answers sort of in a nice little book, says that you can withhold life-saving measures if the person who is actively dying wants you to. Nutrition and oxygen should never be removed, according to Judaism and according to Rabbi Zalman, but providing nutrition may hurt a patient in certain circumstances. So nutrition and oxygen especially is one of the basic needs we all need to breathe. But at a certain point in the dying process, your body stops being hungry and it stops being thirsty. And that is a very natural part of actively dying. And at that point, several studies have indicated that providing nutrition may be more harmful than beneficial. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, very, very famous medical ethicist and rabbi, who very, very often is extremely strict. So when I saw this from him, I thought it was very, very interesting. Even if a patient is unconscious and the doctors say he is no longer capable of experiencing pain, one should not believe them, since it is possible that they are incapable of making such a determination. So Rabbi Feinstein has a very interesting approach to death and dying. He is the most strict out of all the Orthodox rabbis. If you line them up on a spectrum from like the most strict to the least strict, he is way up there as the most strict. And Rabbi Feinstein here is trying, I think, to put the patient first. However, Rabbi Feinstein has been known to shift his opinion. And later on, we will see that he sort of pivots a little bit. The beauty of all the scholars that I'm quoting you here is that many of them are themselves physicians. And if they are not, they don't answer until they seek out people who are and who explain things to them. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein has famously gone back and forth over the concept of organ donation. Since when it first started, it was extremely experimental and fatal. And when he wrote his answer saying, no, Jews should not donate organs at first, he may have had a really good point. And then he shifted his thoughts in the decades that followed. And he said, you know what? Yes, Jews should donate organs. So there is always room in Judaism as science shifts, as technology shifts, there's always room for changing. Brain death. Okay. How many of you have heard of brain death? Show of hands. Show of hands if you've heard of brain death. Okay. Okay. Amazing. So brain death is when the brain stem has been determined to have shut off and the brain controls everything else in the body. So if the brain is no longer getting messages from the rest of the body and vice versa, the organs start to shut down. Brain death is a modern phenomenon. There was no brain death in the time of the Talmud. We didn't have ECGs. We didn't know anything about the brain. So how we apply lessons from the Talmud to the extremely modern concept of brain death is very interesting. And we learn it from this little paragraph in the Talmud in Yoma 85a. If a person is buried under a collapsed building, at what point do you know if they're still alive? So here the rabbis are trying to figure out how much you put yourself in the rubble to sort of figure out who's alive and who's dead. They said one clears up until the victim's nose. If there's no sign of life, if you don't feel them breathing, they are dead. But some say no, you clear until the heartbeat, and you have to feel for a heartbeat. But if several people are buried and one checked, and found that the upper ones under the debris are dead, he should not assume that the ones underneath are already dead. There was an incident, there may have been an incident, there was an incident where they found that the upper ones were dead, but the lower ones were alive. So here we have two references to two different types of death. We have under the nose, and we have a heartbeat. Which classic, are they breathing? Is their heart beating, right? Classic signs of, is somebody alive or is someone dead? But interestingly, is this last little bit where it says, don't just make an assumption. There has been an incident where the upper ones were dead and the lower ones were not. So please don't just assume that somebody is dead. Please do your homework. Please check. What else about brain death? So the same situation, they're in the process of clearing debris. They reached his nose and saw he was not breathing. He should be left there. He has died already. So if someone is not breathing, according to the Mishnah Torah, he's dead. Makes sense. You're not breathing, you are dead. Later, the Shulchan Aruch, who sort of takes all the lessons from the Talmud and sort of distills them nicely and neatly. Even if the victim was found so injured he cannot live for more than a short while, they must still, once again, get rid of all the debris until you reach the nose. If you cannot detect signs of respiration, he is certainly dead, whether the head was uncovered first or the feet were uncovered first. So, somebody is dead if they are not breathing. Classic. Is that brain death? Not necessarily. There's a very famous story that I did not bring down because it's a little bit graphic. Basically, a gentleman is on a horse and his head gets chopped off, as happens in times of yore, and his head is hanging on by a single sinew. And there's a question of whether or not he is dead. And there's a whole long discussion about that. And I said, I really don't want to read that at this hour of night. So that was my recitation of it to you orally. And the whole question of whether he is dead or he is not dead, and this question and these anecdotes as well about debris, and let's take the signs of life, the vital signs of life, help us to paint a picture of how we apply this in modernity. So here's some modern approaches to brain death. So I'm actually going to move you all so that I can see what I wrote here. I apologize. There we go. So Rabbi Wallenberg rejects that brain death is brain death. He doesn't think that the brain can die before the heart. And that is an extremely rabbinic point of view. And by rabbinic, I mean in the Talmud. Because people die if they have no heartbeat. People die if they are not breathing. According to Rabbi Feinstein, yet again, he says breathing of this kind. What kind? He means a breathing machine. He means a ventilator. This is not a sign of life. The breath of life test requires that the patient breathe on his own. Breathing by means of a machine does not satisfy the halachic definition of respiration, and therefore the patient is considered to be dead. But when the ventilator is being serviced or the oxygen replaced, a little bit of old technology here from 1976, it is possible to observe him for a period of possibly 15 minutes. If there is no evidence of independent respiratory activity during this period, it is certain that the patient is dead. So if we go back to the part where it says you have to clear the debris up until the nose to see if someone is breathing on his own, that is applied here. That here, according to Rabbi Feinstein, once again, an extremely strict halachic authority, he does not consider breathing by a machine life halachically. He considers it mechanical and artificial, which is extremely interesting. In 1986, fun fact, the Israeli rabbinate approved the Harvard criterion for brain death. This criterion has changed quite a bit since its inception, but that sort of quietly gets tucked away into the annals of Jewish history. If you were with me in July, I told you that the Israeli rabbinate, the Rabbanut, the sort of religious arm of Israel, works very, very closely with the Ministry of Health. So what they do from a health standpoint has to be kosher from a halachic standpoint. And for 1986, the Israeli rabbinate said brain death is death. Brain death is indeed death, and Jews may consider it death. But this does not solve all of our problems, because once a Jew is on a ventilator, a Jew cannot be withdrawn from that ventilator. So halachically, the person is dead, but you cannot withdraw it from somebody under halacha. So we have painted ourselves a little bit into a corner here. We are saying that mechanical breathing is not halachic breathing, it's not true breathing, the person is dead. But at the same time, we cannot remove the ventilator from them. So what do we do? And how do we solve this problem that who really knew it was a problem until all of this started, until all this modern technology started? In order to explain how that problem is solved, I have to take you on a bit of a tangent. Do you mind coming with me? I'm going to take you over to Israel, where the weather is warmer, and I hope, actually, I don't know, I didn't check. Israel commissioned something called the Steinberg Report, named and headed by Rabbi Dr. Abraham Steinberg, who is still currently the head of Shaarei Tzedek Hospital in Jerusalem. He is a medical physician, he is a rabbi, he is a preeminent medical ethicist. I have his encyclopedia on Jewish ethics down there. It's very, very heavy. The Israeli Ministry of Health, in 2000, put together a committee of 59 individuals. They were representatives from all over the spectrum of religiosity, including Muslims, Christians, and Druze. They were from all different medical specialties and even some lay people as well. Because Israel had questions about dying. Israel, in many, many ways, is one of the world's innovators when it comes to medicine and technology. But they are also a Jewish state. So they had a lot of patients who were saying, wait, you cannot pull my mom off the ventilator, that's against halacha. Or we cannot donate our organs, we are Hasidic Jews. So Israel decided to turn to the Rabbanut, and they opened up this committee called the Steinberg Report. And the Steinberg Report for 5 years discussed what is death and what is dying in a Jewish context. Not only in a Jewish context, but in a modern context as well. So knowing what we know about medicine, about technology, and even about the future of that technology, what do we do? In 2005, the dying patient law was passed. And very briefly, this is what it was. It tried to offer a balance between pikuach nefesh, right, preserving life, and autonomy, Autonomy means that you are in charge of making choices that are the best choices for you. It also tried to understand that Israel is a democratic state and people are people and people have their own opinions. But at the same time, they wanted to prevent unnecessary suffering. Decisions regarding dying patients should be based upon the medical condition, his wishes, and his suffering. For those of you who might be physicians or secular ethicists on this whole, that is not new. That is an extremely Western secular idea. For Israel, that is extremely revolutionary. It's not based on halacha, it's based on the dying patient and what can we medically do about it. It's almost a very realistic approach. Every person is assumed to want to continue living unless they prove otherwise. But here's your piece of Judaism. If there's reasonable doubt, one should always err in favor of life. And then here, the Steinberg report actually defines the term hosses. That term that I told you was a little bit difficult to define. Rabbi Steinberg defined it for us. A dying person is someone who will die within 6 months, no matter what we do for them. And the last 2 weeks of expected life is final stage. So you have 6 months, no matter what, that is somebody who is an hosses. So they laid out their philosophy almost in the last slide. And in this slide, it tells you what we are and are not allowed to do. And I think this will be quite interesting for a host of discussion for many of us. We cannot stop continuous life-sustaining therapies. So there's a difference here between something that is continuous and something that is intermittent. Intermittent is something that can be stopped. Intermittent is intubation, when they put a tube down your throat to help you breathe. Surgery, dialysis, so if you need to go in to get your kidneys cleaned out. Chemotherapy and radiotherapy, radiation. So anything that falls in those categories are, in their opinions, intermittent, and you are allowed to stop them. You are prohibited to do anything that intentionally and actively shortens life. The withdrawal of a ventilator is forbidden. Remember how I said that earlier? That is not halachically breathing, but we can't withdraw it once it's in you. So what do? What would you? So we put a timer on it. Seriously. This is a new medical intervention. The timer ventilator. The timer ventilator works as interruption rather than actively withdrawing. So it falls into that delicious halachic gray category where we are not pulling the plug, and I hate that term, halachically, but what we are doing is allowing the ventilator to stop and allowing natural progression of death to happen. Here's how it works. The ventilator timer is set for a certain amount of hours. It then stops by itself for, I believe it's now stopped for a minute and a half. In that minute and a half, the physician will turn to the family and say, do you want to restart the timer? And they can say yes, or they can say no. During a pilot of this technology, a psychological study was done on the families, and they said, how do you feel? Many of them thought that they were not pulling the plug on their loved one. They were just allowing medicine did whatever it was able to do, and now death could do what it needed to do. And they felt better. They didn't feel guilt. They didn't feel shame. They didn't feel that they were going against Judaism. Pikuach nefesh, oh my God, none of that. This right now is being debated in the Knesset. I don't remember if they actually have a government anymore in Israel or not, but it's supposed to be debated in the Knesset. Since we have some who are opposed to it and some who love it. It's a very interesting solution to a very Jewish halachic problem. So the Steinberg report came to essentially three main points. Number one, withholding food or fluid, absolutely forbidden. Those are essential for life. Two, palliative care that may shorten life is permitted. All right, this is a bit of a myth. But we'll answer that, sorry. Three, distinctions between continuous and intermittent, withholding and withdrawing. Continuous, you can't stop it. You have to keep doing it. Intermittent, sure. Withholding, absolutely. Withdrawing, absolutely not. Let me go to number two for one moment. Palliative care that may even shorten life is permitted. Palliative care is comfort care, it's wraparound care. Palliative care, people view it extremely negatively. They view it as you are putting me in the hallway and you will forget about me. That is not palliative care. Palliative care is actually pain management. And for a really excellent analogy, palliative care in children's hospitals is given to children who are not only dying, but children who have chronic issues. Since palliative care teaches them how to live with their pain. So if we take that approach and we take that reframing, it's a little bit better, number one. Number two, there's a little bit of a debate in the scientific literature about whether or not large doses of pain medication, such as morphine, fentanyl, can indeed lower your respiration rate and in some ways hasten your death. I've read both sides of the argument. I'm not a clinician, I do not know. But what I do know is that halachically, you can do whatever you need to do to palliate your pain, even if it may shorten your life. So number one, withholding food, fluid, don't do it, very bad. Number two, all the drugs, wonderful drugs. And number three, please make distinctions between continuous and intermittent, withholding and withdrawing. And of course, I have saved the best for last. Assisted death in Judaism. I do not call it euthanasia. I call it assisted death because that is the more correct scientific term. The Steinberg report has actually considered euthanasia. It is very, very clear. It prohibits active euthanasia, their words, not mine, their words, but allows patients to give directives in a passive manner. So if a patient has an advanced directive that says no intubation, no CPR, no this, no that, no problem in Israel, but you cannot request to die with assistance. Very, very famously, there is prohibitions against taking a life and committing suicide. And I want to be tremendously cautious here. The reason is because there is a very important debate going on right now in secular ethics. And I was just at a lecture the other day about it. There is a difference between assisted death and suicidality. Suicidality is a way of saying somebody who wants to die for suicide. They want to commit suicide. And there are a lot of physicians who are trying to draw a line between people who want a more humane, peaceful way of dying versus people who just are suicidal. And it's an extremely difficult line to draw. And you can see where it could get jagged or blurry. And they're not quite there yet, to be honest with you. Here in Canada, they are going to open up medical assistance in dying or MAID for those who have mental illness. And these psychiatrists are having a heck of a time trying to figure out, how do we know if somebody is suicidal versus how do we know if somebody just wants to die with help? So famously, Judaism had a hard and fast no. It was the one thing that everyone was united on, from the ultra-Orthodox all the way to the Reform. MAID or assisted death, not happening. A few months ago, that changed. This is hot off the press. I am lucky enough to have a family member who is a rabbi at a shul in Montreal. She is also a scholar in the Reform movement. And she passed on to me their new statement about what we call MAID, or medical assistance in dying. It is one of the most beautifully written halachic statements I have ever seen in my life. And I was pretty convinced that it would end how I thought it would end, which is, we understand that somebody is suffering, but Judaism cannot support assisted death. I was wrong. They set up a beautiful halachic foundation for why, in some instances, assisted death is halachic according to the Reform movement. Is it something that I could see being picked up by others? I don't know. But I do think that it was an extremely brave piece of work. I think it was an extremely important piece of work. And I think that it leaves a lot more questions and a lot more debate to be had. Before I open the floor for questions, I just want to lead you to one other person. He's actually a local in the LA area. He works at Cedars-Sinai. Rabbi Dr. Jason Wenger is the head of the spiritual health department and also Jewish medical ethicist. And he has written and has made publicly available Jewish advanced directives, where he walks you through beautifully, very similarly to how the Steinberg report did, what a Jew may or may not want to receive at the end of his or her life. If you want to, I'm happy to share a link for that document in the chat. But I have a feeling that we have a lot more questions than we have answers. And at this point, I have given you a lot of information, a lot of things to